us about Leonard Peltier, what you know.
Leonard Peltier is an offspring of one of three brothers that came to the United States right after the United States bought the Louisiana Purchase and opened it up for land development. And the three brothers from Sorel, Canada, which is a suburb of Quebec, they came by boat across the Great Lakes to Green Bay, Wisconsin, and then they bought them Consaga carts that they pulled with oxen, and they headed west from there. And my great-great-great-grandfather settled in near Centerville, Minnesota, on what is now Peltier Lake. And one of the brothers settled out in western South Dakota, or maybe it's eastern Montana. I'm not sure. They lived right about where the border is, but I don't know whether they lived in Montana or South Dakota. And the other brother went way on out to, I think it was somewhere around Seattle, Washington. I'm not sure what part of the Washington they settled in. But, of course, there's Peltiers now down in New Orleans, and they are not related. If it is, it's so distant we can't even connect it. But there's a lot of Peltiers up in Canada, and they derived from the brother that settled in, I'll say western Montana, because I'm not sure which state he lived in. He lived right near the border of Montana and South Dakota, whether their place they lived was, but he's part Indian, he's half Indian, and his mother was Indian and his father was a French Canadian Peltier by the name of Peltier. And something else I found out since I learned about this. Of course, I found this out from my grandpa, but of course they didn't have written records of it. It was handed down from generation to generation through the people, word of mouth. But the Peltiers came originally from southern France, near a mountain called Mount Pellier, only they've left the T out. And it probably was named after the family. And I found out that most of the family worked in the casino, Monte Carlo. Now, what they did at Monte Carlo, they might have been janitors for all I know. I don't know if they were gamblers or what, but that's where they originated from. I remember about Grandma Peltier. Her name was Matilda, and everybody called her Maddie. But she would do all of her baking on Saturday. And usually, as a kid, when we'd go visit my grandpa and grandma, it'd be on a weekend. And so on Saturday, when I'd get up that morning, because we'd generally go there on Friday night, why Grandma would be baking in the kitchen. And she always made a lot of bread and made like a couple of cakes like for desserts, and she also made donuts and donut holes, and she would sugar the donut holes, and us kids would get some of them sugared donut holes, and to us that was quite a treat. That's what I remember about my Grandma Peltier. Tell me a memory about Grandpa Peltier. Well, Grandpa Peltier, which Grandma and Grandma were both old people when I was a little kid. And so I only knew them in their very late life. And at that time, Grandpa had earned his living by building barns was his main thing. But in his spare time, he would build boats. And he lived on the shore of a lake called Egg Lake, and he had a dock down there. It was out behind the barn. And he had three boats down there that he had built, and there was good fishing in that lake. There was also good hunting in that lake, And around the shore of the lake there was millions of frogs. Us kids used to catch frogs there just for the fun of it. And anyhow, the grandpa was quite a fisherman and a hunter in his day, although when I knew him, he wasn't doing too much hunting anymore. We went fishing a few times, and I got to go fishing with Grandpa. We caught hundreds of bullheads. There were a lot of bullheads in that lake. And I got to watch him build boats. And later on in life, then I built some boats, because I got the basic idea of how to build them just from watching Grandpa work. The next thing on your list is tell me about meeting FDR, who stands for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I was a Boy Scout. I was about 13 years old, and the president was coming to town. He was on a tour down the Mississippi River inspecting all the new dams that were built along the river, and one of the things he did, it was his idea and his money that got all them dams built, and so he wanted to tour them to see for himself how they worked and one thing and another. And anyhow, in every town along the river, he stopped and gave a speech. Well, Franklin Roosevelt was a cripple. He couldn't walk he had braces on his legs, and he had to use crutches to walk. In almost every one of these towns, they had built a podium so he could get up on it to speak to the crowd, and of course he couldn't get up the steps on the podium to do that. So the speeches he gave had to be right from his car. He was in a limousine, a great big limousine with a chauffeur and all kinds of security people around it. And they had us Boy Scouts act as a help with crowd control. We held ropes and kept the crowd back so they wouldn't overwhelm the president. The next thing on your list is tell me about your first job. My first job when I was probably about 9, maybe 10 years old, they had an ad in the paper. They wanted boys and girls, but to go out in the country to a farm and pick strawberries. You were going to get a nickel a box for the strawberries you picked. And of course, I was picturing strawberries like my mother had in the garden that were pretty good size, and it wouldn't take too many to fill a box. When we got, they hauled us by truck out there. They told us where to be on a Saturday morning, and they picked us up with a truck. And they said there'd be several other kids that would go along. And on the corner I was at where they picked me up, there was 5 or 6 other kids. And they hauled us 6 or 7 miles out in the country to a farm that the strawberry patch was on the side of the hill facing the south, so that you were in the sun all day. And they gave us these boxes, and we were supposed to fill them, and they had somebody out there keeping track of how many boxes you'd fill. Well, the strawberries, to begin with, were small. They were just about marble size. And to fill a box took a lot of work, crawling along on your hands and knees in the dirt in the hot sun. It was actually pretty darn hard work. And I worked all day long without any there was no water, and I didn't think to take any along. Some of the kids had brought bottles of water, but I didn't know that I was going to be in a place that didn't have anything to drink, so I didn't take any. So I was really suffering by the end of the day. I hadn't had a drink all day long and nothing to eat. And I did get 22 boxes of strawberries picked, which amounted to $1.10. I said I'd never do that again. Let's see, next thing is tell me about the naughtiest kid in school. Well, I had a kid when I think I was in 3rd grade, or maybe 4th grade, I'm not sure which one it was. And this kid's name was Bob Armstrong. And he was bigger than all the rest of the kids. He was also dumber than all the rest of the kids, but he would push all the little kids around, including me. I wasn't as big as he was.
and he was a tough that was always picking on the littler kids. And anyhow, 2 or 3 times he'd grab me by the back of the neck from behind, and boy, that just hurt like the devil. And he did that 2 or 3 times. And anyhow, one day in class, I got grabbed by the back of the neck, and I thought it was this Bob Armstrong that had done it. And it wasn't. It was the teacher, and I didn't know that. I'd made my mind up that if he ever grabbed me again like that, I was going to punch him. And so I turned around and punched without looking, and it turned out I punched the teacher, knocked the wind out of him, and I had to go to the principal's office. And of course, when they found out what happened and why I did it, they didn't do too much to me, but that Armstrong got punished instead of me. So that worked out to my benefit. Next question is, tell me one piece of advice you want each child to know. And I would say, I think the main thing is do as I tell you, not as I do, because what I think a kid should do and tell them to do, they don't always do, because kids are copycats. If they see you do something, they try to do it. And we don't always set as good as an example as we should. Tell me about seeing the Northern Lights. Well, living in Minnesota, we would see the Northern Lights almost every week at some time. But they were way in the northern sky. You could see them, but you couldn't see them too clearly. But you could say you saw the Northern Lights because you could see them. And of course, I lived in southern Minnesota, and when we would see the Northern Lights, it would be looking at the sky to the north, and we would be able to see them. But what the spectacular Northern Lights was when I was in Alaska during the war, because when I'd see the Northern Lights, they were almost right directly above us. They weren't way up to the north like they were when I grew up in Winona in southern Minnesota, and we would see the Northern Lights. We could see them on the horizon way off in the distance. But when we saw them in Alaska, it was almost like they were right above us. It looked like you could have reached up and touched them. Of course, you couldn't, but it looked like that. Tell me how you met our mother. Well, I was working for a telegraph line gang, and we happened to be where there was quite a few men in this line gang, and several of them were younger guys about my age. And we traveled all over doing electrical work for the West Union Telegraph Company. We happened to be working in Belle Plaine, Iowa. And I took several of the guys in my car, and we would go from where the Western Union Pullman outfits, which we slept in and ate in, and we lived in them. And we'd go downtown Belle Plaine. There was a pool hall there, and we'd go to the pool hall and play pool. Anyhow, we got acquainted with some of the local guys, and we said something about, don't they ever have any dances or anything around there where you could meet girls? They said, well, if you want to meet girls, go to Tama. Well, we jumped in my car and went to Tama. We found out where they danced. Well, the dance hall wasn't open at the time we got there, so we went to a place called Gus's Candy Kitchen, which was a hangout for the young people. And that's where I saw Virginia, who later became my wife. She was with a couple other girls sitting in a booth having a Coke, and I didn't know her name, and I didn't know anything about her, but she saw me and I saw her, and we smiled at each other, but I don't think we said anything. But something came up about the conversation about going to the dance. They said they were going to the dance, and we said we were going to the dance. So when the dance opened, which was about a block away, sure enough, her and her girlfriends were at the dance. So I asked her to dance, and we hit it off right from the start, and I danced every dance with her, and also made a date for the next Saturday to come to Tama and have another date with her. And I kept that up every weekend for about 5 or 6 weeks. And then one of the times when I was taking her home, we decided to get married instead of just meeting on weekends. We could be together all the time. And so we drove to Missouri and got married. And that was a long story because we were married 69 years, but it started right there in Tama in a dance hall. I guess I answered 2 questions at once here, because the next question is, what qualities first attracted you to her? Well, first of all, she had a real nice smile. She was very pretty. She had a nice figure. And we, right from the first time we got acquainted, we hit it off real good and liked each other. And of course, our married life lasted 69 years, so we did something right. And the next question is, where did you live when you first got married? Well, when we first got married, I was traveling all over with the telegraph company. And after we were married, Virginia went along with me, and she stayed in rented rooms, which didn't work out too good because some of the rooms, some of the towns didn't have a regular place that rented rooms, and we'd have to try to get a room with somebody in a house that had an empty bedroom, and it didn't always work out so good, so we ended up buying a trailer, and we pulled the trailer around everywhere we went, and that worked out a lot better, and we had that trailer for about a year. And then I quit the crew because Virginia was pregnant with Gary, and of course Sherry was a baby at that time, just about a little over a year old, and it was quite a hardship traveling with a trailer. And of course we had the dog Muggs with us, and everything was quite complicated and quite hard on everybody, so we ended up quitting the gang and got a job in Marshalltown with a company called Marshall Electric. And you got a thing down here, cousin Alfred? Mm-hmm. Okay. My cousin Alfred, who was a couple of years older than I am, came to live with us because his mother, who was also Irene's mother, Irene was Al's older sister, and they both ended up coming to live with us. Originally, Irene came because there was no high school in the town she grew up in Hugo. There was a grade school, but no high school. So after she graduated 8th grade, she wanted to get 4 years of high school, and she couldn't do it in Hugo, so she came to live with us. Well, then after their mother got shot, and ended up a cripple. She had to live the rest of her life in a wheelchair. Why, Alfred also came to live with us, and then he went to high school and went on and graduated there also. So we had the brother and sister living with us for about 5 or 6 or 7 years. Of course, Irene ended up marrying a guy by the name of Saraki, Irvin Saraki, and her name changed from Irene Cummings to Irene Saraki, and she lived in Winona her whole life, and until she got to where she had to go to like a nursing home. Then she moved into one in St. Paul because she had a son that lived there. Alfred graduated. Right after he graduated, the war broke out, and he ended up in the Army, and he learned to be a pilot, which is the same thing I did during World War II. But he ended up as a pilot that was training other pilots. He was somewhere down in New Mexico. I'm not sure what town it was, which air base, but he spent the whole war there training pilots fighter pilots to fly. He didn't have to worry about being in combat because of that, but he did. It ended up ruining his health because of something to do with the flying the airplanes interfered with his heart. He ended up having heart trouble the rest of his life. And they said it was because of the flying he was doing. Most famous person you met? Well, probably the most famous was when I was a Boy Scout and met Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the President of the United States. That would have been in 1933 or 34. I'm not sure which year it was. But when the President was inspecting the dams that time, I was on duty on the crowd control with the rest of the scouts. We had ropes that would hold up and keep the crowd back. And the next important person I probably met was when I met Edwin G. Robinson at a theater in Chicago. And I happened to be in Chicago before the war working in a defense plant. And my dad was there because the company had sent him there for some schooling. And we went to the movie together, and the movie was it was about Edwin G. Robinson, the movie was, and he was there to advertise it, and he was in the lobby greeting people. And that's how we got to meet him. And I mean, he didn't know us from Adam. We knew who he was, but he didn't know who we were, but he shook everybody's hand as they were going in. Wasn't no big deal, really, but the only other famous person I remember meeting was when I was in the Army and I ended up in Alaska. This Joe Louis, who was called the Brown Bomber, in his time, he was a world's heavyweight champion, prize fighter, and he was touring the troops for he was putting on a boxing demonstration in almost every air base in the North American continent. And he happened to be at the base I was at to put on a demonstration. I was in the recreation room playing pool, and he picked up a pool cue and said, "You want to play a game?" And I said, "Well, sure, I'll play." I said, I was no match for him. He ran the table. I never got to shoot a ball. My first car, the next question. My first car was a 1926 Model T Ford that I got for $20, and I drove it to school for 2 years, and that would have been probably my sophomore, junior, and senior year. I guess it would have been, yeah. Last 2 years I was in school. My junior and senior year, I drove to my Model T Ford. Then after I graduated, I sold it to a guy, got my $20 back, and then I bought a Model A Ford. It was a little newer car and a little better condition than the old Model T was. That was my first car. And the thing that was unusual about it was it only had one door to get in and out. It was a closed car. It had windows all the way around, and it had 2 bucket seats in front and a bench seat in the back. And the one door you got in was between the passenger front seat and the back bench seat. And everybody had to go in and out through that one door, which was very unusual. Next question is about trapping and freezing my hands. When I was about 9 years old, I started trapping mushrats in the swamp part of Lake Winona, and there was all kinds of muskrat, they call them muskrat dumps. They were actually the muskrat homes. And in the summertime, when the lake wasn't frozen, you couldn't get anywhere near them unless you had a boat, which I didn't have. But in the wintertime, when the ice froze, we could walk right up to the muskrat dumps. And so I learned how to trap stuff from my grandpa Peltier. He showed me how to treat traps and how to set them and how to catch game like that. And so I started trapping muskrats, and for the whole season I trapped 78 muskrats. My dad showed me how to skin them and how to dry the skins on a board. And at the end of the year I had 78 muskrats, and I sold them and got over $100 for the skins, which I bought myself a new rifle and a new bicycle and a new pair of what they called high-top boots. Each boot had a pocket made on the side. One I carried a knife, and well, it came with a knife, and the other side had a small flashlight that you'd carry in the boot. I really thought that was something to have high-top boots with them capabilities of them things. Not everybody had them, and I was really proud of them boots. But anyhow, while I was trapping, this one day it turned real cold. I got my gloves wet, and the gloves froze stiff, and I couldn't get my hands back in them. And I wanted to finish the trap line, because if you didn't, wild animals would, after the muskrats were caught in the trap, wild animals would come and eat them up, like coyotes and fox and that type of thing. And of course, after they'd ate them up, the pelt was all shot. You know, they couldn't save the pelt, and so I had to get the traps out of the muskrats out of the traps before the wild animals got them. So I was out there in the cold with my hands wet, and my hands got frozen. When I got home, I couldn't even turn the doorknob to get in the house. I had to kick the door, and my mother had to let me in. My hands were so badly frozen. The doctors told my folks that I would lose all my fingers, because they said they'd turn black and I'd lose them. But my dad knew an old army doctor from World War I who lived in our neighborhood, and he took me to him, and he said to rub my hands with cocoa butter every day, and it would save my hands. And he knew what he was talking about, because I've still got all my fingers. I did lose a couple of fingernails, but they eventually grew back. But they grew back kind of funny. Anyhow, I learned the lesson from then on to keep my hands covered, because once my gloves got frozen, I couldn't put my hands back in the gloves, and consequently, out in very cold weather, my hands froze. And I hadn't had any experience with anything like that, so I didn't realize my hands were frozen until I got home. Couldn't open the door. The next question on here is Alaska and a bear. And that's probably when a guy by the name of Bill Hughes and I were stationed in Alaska together. And we were part of a search and rescue team that was out there to rescue downed airplanes and the people in them. That was our job. And anyhow, while we were up there, when we were flying around, we saw this deserted gold mine. And we decided we would go up to the gold mine and see if we could find any gold. And anyhow, to get there, the first time, we had to walk to get there. And the river zigzagged, but we would try to save walking instead of following the bank of the river, which zigzag meaning we'd have to walk a lot of miles to get where we wanted to go. But when we cut across the zigs, and there was game trails like that went through along there, and anyhow, we were following one of these game trails heading up to the where the gold mine was, and we'd been up to the gold mine a couple of times before this happened. And the other times when we went up, we never encountered any animals along the way, but this one time we encountered this, and by the way, when we left the base, one of the sled dogs had gone along with us. They wouldn't keep them tied up in the summertime. They'd let them run free. Well, this one dog followed us into the woods and stayed with us all the way up to the gold camp. And anyhow, this one time when we were going up there, we encountered this female bear with 2 cubs. And when we saw her, she immediately charged because she recognized us as a threat. Well, the dog saved our lives because she attacked the bear, and it gave us time to climb trees to get away from the bear. We each had a rifle, but you can't climb a tree with a rifle in your hands, so we had to leave the rifles down below. We got up in the trees far enough up that the bears couldn't reach us from the ground, and they can't climb trees. Now, little black bears can, but brown bears, these were what are called Kodiak brown bears, and they can weigh up to 800 pounds, but they can't climb a tree. So when we were up in the trees, we were safe, but the bears ended up killing the dog, and they ate her right there in front of us. And of course, then we were up here, we were trapped up in the tree, and you know, as long as the bears were there, we couldn't come down. And we both had sidearms. I had a .22 revolver in a holster on my hip, and the other guy had a .32 revolver in a holster on his hip. But them weapons would have never stopped the bear. All they do is make the bear madder, more angry. But finally, the bear, after the dog said, the bears had eaten the dog, and the dog was completely gone, why, they wandered off. But it took us a long time to get up enough nerve to climb down the trees and get our rifles. And we finally, instead of going to the gold mine, we turned around and went back to the base. But, you know, after we saw that, what the bears did to that dog, we could imagine what would happen to us if we'd have got caught by the bear. Would have been history. And so it was, I used to have nightmares about that situation. And there were several times during the night my wife said I gave blood-curdling screams that about scared the wits out of her. She never let me forget that happened, because every now and then she'd mention it, that I'd have them bad dreams about that happening. Next question on the list is my favorite radio show. Well, the one that sticks in my mind that I remember the most was when the whole family would get together around the radio, and that wasn't too long after radios became a household thing where every household had a radio, because at one time when I would go like to visit all my relatives up in Minnesota, none of them had a radio. We had a radio in Winona, but for some reason we were one of the first families to have a radio in that neighborhood that I knew of. And anyhow, on Sunday night we would listen to Red Skelton. That was one of our favorite shows. And the whole family would get together and sit around and listen to the radio, to the Red Skelton show. Next question on here is hitchhiking. Before World War II, anywhere you would go along almost any highway, you would encounter hitchhikers. Everybody hitchhiked in them days. It wasn't considered dangerous because there had never been any hitchhikers that anybody ever knew of that was ever molested or killed or raped or beat up or anything. They never had a problem. Hitchhikers were always considered one of the things that would happen when you're driving along the road, and almost everybody would pick up hitchhikers. If you got out there with and put your thumb out, you usually about the third car that'd come along would stop and pick you up. Ask you how far you're going, and you'd get acquainted with the people, and they'd even go out of their way to get you where you wanted to go. So hitchhiking was considered the thing to do. And it was even so a little bit after the war, because when I was married and living in Tama, I was registered for the draft up in Albert Lea, Minnesota. And I got a notice in the mail, which went to my folks' house, and then they forwarded it to me, that I had to report to the draft board for a physical. Well, my car was broke down right at that time, and I didn't have the money to fix it. And so we hitchhiked up to Albert Lea. Virginia and I hitchhiked up to Albert Lea, and so I could have my physical. And then, of course, when I got the physical over with, we wanted to get back to Tama, so we hitchhiked back. And it wasn't, nowadays, to think of a couple hitchhiking along the road, you hear all these horror stories of people being attacked and robbed and raped and killed, and so very few people hitchhike anymore because it's too scary. But back when we were hitchhiking, everybody did it. Never anybody ever had any problems. But things changed. It became too scary to hitchhike, so now nobody hitchhikes. Next question on here is climbing a mountain. Well, in 1944, I was in the Army, and had just got done with my tropical training because I was going to get shipped to the South Pacific, and I had appendicitis attack, and they took me to the hospital and took my appendix out, and anyhow, after I got my appendix out, I was in the hospital for 3 weeks, I think it was. And after I got out, why, they sent me to a place called Idaho Springs, Colorado, and there's a mountain there called Old Baldy, and we were sent to the top of this mountain for survival training. We had to learn how to snare rabbits and how to catch wild game and how to tear an airplane apart and get all the useful stuff out of it we could use to make weapons, and to make a shelter, and build a fire and all that type of thing. And that whole training session was all about survival in case you crash, whether it be anywhere in the world. You could use an awful lot of the airplane as for weapons and for shelter and for survival, for flares, for signals, and that type of thing. And that's what that course was all about. But anyhow, we had to climb that mountain. It was 11,000 feet, Old Baldy was. And we had to climb to the top of it and camp up there for a week. And we were supposed to live off the land, but we also had some what they called mountain rations. So if you weren't lucky enough to catch some wild animals, why, you had the sea rations or mountain rations you could live on. So they weren't very tasty, but at least you keep you from starving.
And who?
A what?
A hero.
Oh, well, yeah, I had a hero in Winona. The first time I ever flew with a guy in Winona by the name of Max Conrad. He ran the local airport, and I did some odd jobs out there, like clean out the toilet, the men's toilet, and the women's toilet, and stuff like that. Nothing very exciting, but when I got paid by getting a free airplane ride. And I really thought that was neat, to be able to. Of course, I didn't fly the plane; I just rode. But to me, that was quite a thrill to ride in an airplane. I'd never done anything like that before. And I didn't do anything after that until I was in the Air Corps, but I chose flying over everything else. But the guy, by the way, that Max Conrad had relatives right here in Cedar Rapids. Yeah, there's people. If you look in the phone book under the name Conrad, C-O-N-R-A-D, there's a family by that name living here yet. And they're I guess it would have been an uncle lived in Winona and ran the local airport. On Pearl Harbor Day, I was working for Marshall Electric in Marshalltown. We had been installing an electric water heater in the basement, which in them days the electricians used to install the water heaters. We not only did the electrical, we also had to do the plumbing. Anyhow, we installed this water heater, and when I got home, the next morning I got a telephone call that the water heater was leaking down the basement, and I had to go back there to stop the leaks. And while I was there working on it, I came up out of the water heater was of course in the basement, and I came up out of the basement to go out to my truck, and this woman was laying on the floor, and I went over to see why she was laying there, and she had fainted, and I didn't know that. I thought she'd had a heart attack or something. And about the time I bent over, her husband walked in, they were on a farm, of course, and he had been out to the barn, and I hadn't seen him, and he knew that he had a leak in the basement, but he didn't know I had come back to fix it. Anyhow, he thought I'd attacked his wife or something, and he was getting pretty hostile. And then about that time, his wife came, she had fainted, she come back too, and she told him that the war had broke out in Japan had attacked in Pearl Harbor, and the reason she fainted is their son was in Pearl Harbor, and they told that there was thousands of casualties, and she figured her son had probably been killed. That's why she fainted. And so we ended up listening to the news for a couple hours about the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor, but I got the leak. What I went out there to do was fix the leaks, so I got that done. And then after we listened to the news, I ended up eating dinner with him that noon. And then before I went back to town, life-threatening situations. Well, I had two life-threatening situations while I was in the Army. The one is I told about with the bear. The other one was when my plane got hit by shrapnel when I was flying over by Guam, and ended up getting sprayed with shrapnel, and I landed the plane at Guam, and they said that plane shouldn't have flown. They didn't think it would make it back to Guam, but I did. And I said, the Lord must have been riding with me, because I don't even remember landing the plane. They took me out and took me to the hospital. I spent a week there, and then they sent me back to the States. And that's how come I got sent up to Alaska, because I got sent back after I got healed up, where I had set up for reassignment, and I got sent to Alaska to work with a search and rescue team up there, and I finished the war at that job. But one other life-threatening situation I had was before I went in the Army. I was working for the Western Union Telegraph Company, and we were building lines along railroad tracks, and anyhow we had a job to do at Forreston, Illinois, and we were there for about 3 weeks. Some boxcars had jumped the track and tore out several poles, and we had to go out there and put the poles back in and transfer all the wires to the new poles. And when we got all done, we after 3 weeks we went back. The day that I'm talking about, we went back to tag the poles. We had tags that put in that tell the date them poles were put in the ground, so that later on they could tell how old the poles were. Because periodically they would get rotten and they would have to replace them. Anyhow, while we were there, we always had a conductor that would ride on our motor car when we were going out to work. His job was to make sure that we got the motor car off the tracks, which we had 8 or 10 men with us always, and we'd lift the motor car off, even though it weighed 1,000 pounds. We'd lift the motor car off the tracks one end at a time, and get it out of the way of the trains, because this was the main line of the Milwaukee, and there was a lot of fast trains on that track. And anyhow, every day about the same time, the meat train would go from Omaha to Chicago. That train would travel about 85 or 90 miles an hour. Anyhow, the conductor had just checked in the depot just a matter of 10-15 minutes before the incident I'm talking about happened. And what happened is he had gone in the depot and said, we're all right, we can make it to the next town, and then we'll set the motor car off. And we got on the motor car and started on the tracks, and one of the guys yelled, hey, here comes the meat train. We turned to look, and sure enough, here come the meat train, and that thing was traveling about 90 miles an hour, and all we could go on the motor car was 30 or 35 miles an hour. And when everybody saw that meat train, everybody started to jump off. And when they jumped off, even though I was giving it all the gas I could give her, the wheels were spinning, and I couldn't get any traction to try to outrun it. And besides, something going 40 miles an hour can't outrun something going 90 miles an hour. So last time I looked over my shoulder, it looked like that train was almost right behind me. And I jumped without looking where I was even jumping to, and I landed in the dirt and rolled. And when that train hit that motor car, it exploded in 1,000 pieces. And I hit the ground and rolled and come up. And I jumped off on the left side of the train because you drove the motor car on the left just like you do an automobile, where all the men that had been on the car were all riding on the right side. And when they jumped off, they were on the right side of the train, so the train was separating me from all the rest of the people. So after I jumped off of the thing and the motor car was all in pieces, I started walking back towards the rear of the train because I could hear the brakes going on the train, and I knew they were trying to stop it. And when I got to the back end of the train and crossed over to the other side, I looked up along the train right away, and everybody was out in the weeds. And there was a colored guy, he must have been a hobo on the train, and he was off standing along the side of the train. And I said, "What's everybody doing out in the weeds?" He said, "Oh, the colored guy said, we hit some bull and we was looking for his carcass." And holy cow, they must be looking for me. So I walked up along the tracks, and I ran into several other people, and I didn't know if they were hobos or railroad men, but none of them knew me, and I didn't know them. And it wasn't until I got another block or two up along the tracks that I started running into some of the Western Union people, and of course they immediately recognized me, and they said, "My gosh, how did you survive that? We thought you were dead." And I said, "Well, I jumped." And they said, "Well, we didn't see you jump." And I said, "Well, I jumped." And of course, the motor car was demolished, and after they got the rest of the motor car and stuff off the front end of the engine, which some of it was plastered to the front end, they had to pry it off. It hit it so hard that it was just entangled in the mechanisms, and they had to get it off. Well, when that was off, the train took off for Chicago. That was a fast meat train. They had to get that meat there. The only way they had to keep the meat fresh was with ice, and it would melt, so they couldn't waste any time. All the railroad men got back on the train, and the train pulled out and left us. We had about a 4-mile walk back to where our telegraph Pullman outfit was, and it took us a long time to walk back. The conductor got fired, and he was only a half a year from retirement. He was done working. And the foreman got fired, and he was an old guy. He was not too far from retirement with the West Union. He got fired. But all the rest of us kept our jobs, but we had another motor car, and I was telling Jeff about it, that it was what was called a friction drive. Instead of the other motor car that got smashed up, you didn't have to steer it like a car because it followed the rails, but you had to shift it like a stick shift. And because all the men that were on the crew that had cars all had automatics, none of them knew how to run a stick shift. So I got the job as running the motor car. That's how come I happened to be on it when the train hit it. But when the train hit the motor car and I jumped at the last minute, the people that had jumped off, the men that were the Western Union men that had jumped off the motor car when we first saw the train blocked their view, that they didn't see me jump off. The last they saw me, I was still on the motor car. Then they saw the pieces of the motor car when the train hit it flying in the air, that it exploded like. And they thought that, that I was in that explosion. They thought I was a goner. But I had jumped and hit the ground, and there was pieces of the motor cars flying all over when it hit. But at 90 miles an hour, when it hit that motor car, it was probably 20 feet ahead of me. And so I didn't get hit by anything. But, of course, they had an investigation. I had to explain my part of it. And the straw boss had to explain his part of it. He kept his job because he had done what he was supposed to do, but the foreman was the one that should have made sure that the conductor did his job and we didn't get hit.
That's why he lost his job. Is that it?
That's it.